and newsagents.
What happened with Liz and myself was a big part of the defeat, but it wasn't the only ingredient. What did that mean?
You know, people like to blame one person.
Have you apologised?
All of this endless apology. I mean, I've apologised on Piers Morgan. Okay, if it makes you feel better, I will apologise to everybody I should apologise to.
Well, I'm joined in the studio now by Kwasi Kwarteng, citizen, no longer Member of Parliament, certainly no longer Chancellor of the Exchequer after that very, very brief spell. But welcome to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean.
So a new poll came out yesterday which said that 6 out of 10 Britons just couldn't give a monkey's who the next Conservative Party leader is. I kind of read it, and 31% of those were Conservative voters. I just wonder whether the Conservative Party is lost.
No, I think it's often the case, particularly after you've suffered a big defeat, that the last thing people want to hear from is Tory politicians. You know, they've had, I think, the electorate, and they expressed their view in the general election, they've had enough hearing about Tory dramas. They want to move on. They were sick of us. They booted us out of office. And so it doesn't surprise me that a large majority don't want to hear from Tories and aren't interested in who the leader is. And that happened, I think, in 97 when we lost. It certainly happened, I think, when Labour were out of power in 2010. I mean, there were the 2 Miliband's and that drama. But I think it's quite normal for electorates just to move on. And they will get more interested in what the Tory party is saying once the government's honeymoon has ended. And when, mid-term, there'll be difficulties the government faces. And I think opposition's become much more relevant.
Do you see any of the candidates who you think, yeah, that's the person?
Well, I like many. I mean, I'm in the privileged position of knowing all the candidates. I think they're pretty strong. They've all got their different strengths. I tend to probably be on the Badenoch-Jenrick side of things. But James Cleverly, I know very well. Tom Tugendhat is an old friend. Mel Stride, I know well, and Priti Patel. So all of them are, I think, are good Conservatives.
I don't know whether it would help them or harm them if you said, I'm backing this one.
Well, I would never do that. And I think you're right. I think generally it's the kiss of death, not just a function of me being who I am, but also other senior politicians. It doesn't work for people really to endorse their favourites. I think they're a good crop of candidates. Controversially, I think they're probably a better crop than we had in 2022. But time will tell how effectively they run.
So one of the ways that the choice is being characterised in the Conservative Party is that does the party go in a more Farageist, anti-immigrant, white nationalist direction as the way to kind of solidify that right flank that did them so much damage in the general election?
Yeah, I don't buy that. I mean, I think that you've got to remember that 4.1 million people voted for reform. And to characterise 4 million people in the way using the adjectives you've just done, I don't think is fair. Also, the polling suggested that of those 4 million, something like 60% of them had voted for the Conservatives in 2019. Now, friends of mine will say, well, of course, in the past, they weren't necessarily Conservatives. They voted for UKIP, they voted for Labour, they voted for all sorts of parties. But in the last general election before this one, a large number of those reform voters voted Conservative. And I think whoever leads the party will have to address that. I don't think it means adopting the full fat reform agenda. It doesn't mean necessarily bringing Nigel Farage into the party.
It doesn't necessarily mean.
No. It doesn't necessarily mean that, because Nigel is one individual and you've got 4 million voters, and it's the job of the leader to appeal to those voters.
Sure, but let me flip that question round. Would it be positively harmful for the Conservative Party to embrace Nigel Farage?
I think it's difficult. Look, I know Nigel, he's a friend. I think it's difficult just to bring him in when he's sought to do damage to the Conservative Party and he's run against us. So, but in
we
politics...
had Chris Patton on the podcast and he described Nigel Farage as Tommy Robinson in a cravat.
I think that's too harsh. And also, whatever you say about Nigel, whatever you think of him, the fact that any leader of the Conservative Party has to deal with is the fact that Reform got 4 million votes. Now, Chris Patton is from a different, slightly different wing of the party to me. I have respect for him. But I think that as a leader, a practical leader taking over the party this year, which they will do, they've got to work out what they're going to do with those 4 million voters. Now, it might be that they say, well, we don't want to touch them with a barge pole. Reformers can rally their support and we're not going to touch that. But I think that would be the wrong thing to do. I think electorally, if you're trying to essentially be a centrist party, there are at the moment 3 or 4 parties that do that. The Conservative Party's, strength traditionally, I think, and we can have a debate about that, has been that it's consolidated the right. And the problem we had this election, and I'm just as old enough just to remember the 83 election, you'll remember, we had a huge majority. The Conservatives
you're trying to say I'm very old.
I'm not having a dig at you. We're all young.
I do remember.
We're all young.
The 83 election was the first one I reported on.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, you'll remember at that time, the left were split, essentially. And I remember, and I was totally apolitical, I was 9 or 10 or something like that, but the left were completely split between the SDP and Labour. And Margaret Thatcher got the biggest Tory majority since the war. And we were in a similar situation, I would suggest, this year, where essentially the right, centre-right vote, I would suggest, was split between Reform and the Conservatives. And I was looking at some of these results. I mean, there were tons of people that I knew as right-wing MPs who were defeated very narrowly by Labour candidates, where the Reform Party got thousands and thousands of votes. And so I think with the split right, the first past the post is unforgiving. And so that's why a big cause of why we had these big...
But there seems to be an assumption in your thinking that all you need to do is to bring back the 4.1 million people who voted for Reform, add them to the people who voted Conservative, and hey presto, you've got a majority.
So that's crude. I don't agree with that.
But you're going to lose centre-right Conservatives as well.
Yes.
Who kind of are in the mould of Chris Patten or Michael Heseltine or Ken Clarke or Rory Stewart or any number of people.
So I describe it as a two-step. So I think first of all you've got to essentially try and consolidate your base in whatever way is convenient according to your traditions and according to your values. And then you have to appeal to the centre. And American politics used to be framed in that way. So you looked at presidential candidates, they would secure the base, and then once they won the nomination, they would move to the centre. That was an established, I mean, it's different now, but that was an established route. And I think, actually, if you look at where the Conservative Party is, it has to do something similar to that. Because I think if you just say to the 4 million votes or whoever the Reform people are saying, you don't share our values, we don't agree with you, we will fight you, I think you're left with a very small base, a very small platform on which to build the party.
How do you unite the party when, a lot of Conservative voters think that Brexit's been a disaster and has offered nothing, that the ideological direction of saying we get out of the, European Court of Human Rights, we're very anti-immigrant, all the rest of it, that they just don't feel comfortable with that as the conservatism that they think of.
So it's very tricky because the kind of, and I've referred to your age inadvertently and mine, but the kind of world we grew up in was very much quite static politically. Essentially, Labour had roughly 40%, 35 to 40%. The Tories roughly could rely on 35 to 40%. And every general election, most general elections, certainly in the 60s and 70s, you were splitting the difference. You were trying to work out how you appeal to the middle ground. I think the electorates are much more volatile now. And you say, yes, lots of Conservatives are very disappointed with Brexit. But the coalition that we had in 2019, on which Boris Johnson won, which he won that majority of 80, was very pro-Brexit, very red wall focused. And there was a world, I mean, you could argue that he messed things up, but there was a world in which that was going to be a new Conservative coalition. And in fact, a lot of the commentary at the time was that the Tories would be in 10 years, Boris would be in for that long, for 10 years, all of that. That all collapsed. But my point is that the electorates are very volatile, and so the next leader of the Tory party will have to build a new coalition. And I suspect the coalition will be around, strong borders on immigration, probably a pro-Brexit platform, and they might be sceptical on net zero. I don't know, but there'll be a platform on which they can build the party.
I don't want to go down a whole Brexit rabbit hole, but isn't the problem that during the Brexit campaign, everyone was offered the best of all worlds? We would stop free movement, net migration figures would come down, Britain's economy would boom. We would be Singapore on Thames. We would carry on trading as though we were still in a single market or a customs union with the European Union. And, at 2019, let's get Brexit done, which was a very powerful slogan because people were rightly pissed off at how long it was all taking. But actually, when the rubber hit the road and the reality of Brexit set in, none of those things was true.
So look,
net migration soared. We weren't doing as much trade. Our economic performance declined, etc.
Well, I don't believe that, because if you look at the economic growth figures in Europe, they're not much better than ours. And in fact, the last time I looked, ours were revised up, and they're slightly better, but not much better. And you're right to say that lots was promised, as in lots of campaigns, lots was promised. But I think the fundamental problem we had with Brexit was that when we lost our majority in 2017, and that was the thing that created a lot of confusion. I mean, I remember standing in that parliament and Theresa May said, "Strengthen my hand," because the assumption was that she was going to get a big majority. And if she had got that majority, I think a lot of the storm and stress and crazy parliamentary stuff that was going on wouldn't have happened. And I don't think Brexit would have been a huge issue. And actually at the time, I never thought it was going to be a heaven or a hell. I mean, if you speak to Remainers and Brexiteers, Remainers think it was the biggest disaster that ever happened. And the Brexiteers are thrilled that we left. I think it was always a balanced argument. And clearly a lot of the things that we wanted to happen from Brexit haven't happened. But there were lots of other reasons for that. There was an energy crisis, there was the Ukraine invasion, there was COVID, there were all sorts of other things which superseded the fundamental question of Brexit.
So the day after the election, I think on July the 5th, you appeared on TV and you said, what happened with Liz and myself was a big part of the defeat, but it wasn't the only ingredient. What did that mean?
That's exactly right. I think that the episode of the mini budget, which I was involved in, when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, I think that did damage the party. But there were other things that went wrong. That's all I was saying. So, people like to blame one person. And I think actually the people, if you look at the way the Tory party was led over the last 5 years, I think all the leaders have some share of the blame. Now, you can apportion differently, who was the most culpable. I think that's a pretty futile game. I think the three leaders we had, frankly, and I got on with them all personally, just weren't good enough to make a convincing case for the Conservative Party at the election.
Were you good enough?
I question myself all the time. I think, if you are a leader, which I was at the top, near the top of the party, and things go wrong, I think you have to look at yourself. And the French have this phrase, autocritique, which is self-criticism. You've got to be able to do that. And I think a lot of our leaders in the recent past haven't done that. There were things I would have liked to have done differently. And I've reflected on that, and I've actually spoken about it as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. Just going back to the election defeat, 175 Tories lose their seats.
Yeah, it was probably more than that.
You have said I was a big part of that.
I was a part of it. We can argue about how big a part I played.
Well, your quote was you were a big part of it. Have you apologised?
All of this endless apology. I mean, I've apologised on Piers Morgan. All of that. I think it's foolish. I don't think it makes any sense. I mean, politicians make decisions. Some of them go well, some of them go badly. And if every politician that made a mistake apologised, I don't see how that would improve our situation. What we can do is look very analytically at what went wrong, which I've tried to do, and say how we should have done things better. And I think that's very important.
So you don't think saying sorry matters?
I think, yeah, if it makes you feel better, I will apologise to everybody I should apologise to. I think
that's
it does
a non-apology.
matter.
In psychological
terms. This is always what happens in politics. As a politician, they say apologise, and then when you do apologise, they say, "Oh, but that's a non-apology."
No.
You can't win in this game. You cannot win. You cannot win in public life as a consequence. Of course, I feel regret. I think the people who really suffered were the people who were getting their mortgages fixed, and it was a narrow group of people. But people who were looking to getting remortgage at the time of the mini budget, I think, were very adversely affected. Now, in terms of general mortgage holders and payers, the interest rates were going up, and now you could argue, to what extent the mini budget caused the interest rates, the bank rate, to go up at what speed. I don't think it made that much difference, but that's something one can argue. But then apologising to MPs I don't think that's necessarily necessary. I mean, and also the other thing you have to look at is the campaign. We fought an appalling campaign. The mini budget happened 2 years ago. And as I've said publicly, the campaign that we fought 2 months ago was one of the worst we've ever fought. So if you want to apportion blame, there were lots of different elements of this.
Okay, so a lot of blame to go round. When you talk about the campaign being awful, and was it the individual mistakes of D-Day?
Everything. I mean, the announcement of the campaign, and it transpired. I mean, there was a story in the Times, I think, earlier this week, that he wanted to cancel. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, wanted to cancel going early. The party was in a terrible state. I mean, I'd announced my departure, my resignation, my leaving Parliament in February. We didn't even have a candidate. 3.5 months later, we didn't have a candidate in Spelthorne. And luckily, my successor, a very able man, I think he was selected 2 weeks after the election was called. And he won the seat. The report I saw was that we had 190 seats that didn't have candidates. And our Prime Minister called the election. And as a friend of mine...
Was Sunak an idiot?
Well, I don't think he was an idiot, but I think he made bad judgments. I mean, how can you call a surprise election where your party is less prepared than the opposition, which was exactly the case? They had far fewer candidates to select. They had anticipated an election in May, so they were prepared for that. And so when the election was actually called, the Labour Party were in a much better position, had raised more money, had bought advertising space. They were in a much stronger position than the Conservative Party was. And you can't tell me that that was a smart move.
He did say sorry, I think. He did say sorry to his staff.
Well, he was the Prime Minister and he led the campaign. What we did 2 years ago.
So that apology counts.
Well, I mean, that's what he chose to do. He was the leader of the party. If I was the Prime Minister, maybe I would apologise during the campaign and had lost as significantly as he had done. I think that was a reasonable thing for him to do.
Let me put another critique to you, which I kind of was struck by when you were talking. I sensed your frustration at being asked about apologising and saying sorry, and that it was kind of annoying. And look, you did the best you could. Is there a tendency among people who've had the same education as you, like Boris Johnson, Eton, Oxbridge, that politics is a bit of a game?
No, I don't think it is at all. I mean, Boris can speak for himself, but it's not really a fun game. I mean, you get endless abuse. It was a very demanding time. I think it was a tough time for the country. You're trying to negotiate colleagues. I think it's a very odd game for people to enter, given the pressures and and it's an honour as well. I mean, it's a privilege. You've really got to want to do it. But I don't see it as a game in the way you're suggesting. And I think the whole Eton Oxbridge thing is way overblown. I think it's interesting historically. It so happened that we've had people near the top of the party that had that sort of education. And
Lots of them.
Yeah, a lot.
I mean, totally disproportionate.
Well, yeah, the Eton thing I think is unusual. But Tony Blair was at a private school. Lots of people at the top of parties have been at private schools. The new government is different. And I think, society's evolving. I don't suppose you'll see that many people with private school educations and all the rest of it being in politics necessarily.
We're going to take a short break. We will be back in a moment to talk about the mini budget and Liz Truss. And Kwasi Kwarteng is still with us. Let's talk about that period in 2022. Liz Truss hung you out to dry. I mean, it was pretty humiliating. Ghastly. You were at the IMF, you're suddenly called back.
Yeah, that was bizarre. I mean, sorry to cut across you, but I'm still slightly surprised that happened, because it was obvious to me that if I was sacked, that would be the end. So essentially, and I've said this, when I was in the cabinet room in Downing Street and it was just the two of us speaking, I literally thought to myself, you've killed yourself politically, metaphorically. You've essentially destroyed your premiership. And I think I made that point gently to her. And I said, look, they're going to come after you. You don't have a fire break. And my thinking was that she'd last about 3 weeks. And actually, if you looked at the Sunday Times, 2 days after I was sacked, they reported, I don't know how they got it, but maybe I told a special advisor, but it said Kwarteng says she has 3 weeks. I thought she'd last 3 weeks. In the event, she resigned 6 days after sacking me. So the whole thing was concertinaed into a very short time. And I remember getting a text, a WhatsApp from a donor saying, what's she done? She's just destroyed herself. So I was very puzzled.
Why do you think she did it?
I think there comes a point, and this is where I've slightly changed my views since that episode, since what I experienced. People talk about experience, people talk about knowledge or cleverness, or, you said, is Sunak an idiot? I think the fundamental thing I would say about leadership is having the right temperament. And I think certain people are prone to panic, regardless of their experience or their intellect. And certain people have a calmer, more considered approach to difficult situations.
So Liz Truss was in the former category.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think
She panicked.
I think so. I mean, one would have to ask her. But to me, it's a great shame that she only lasted 7 weeks. I mean, I lasted 6 weeks, and if she'd sacked me and then been able to stabilise the government as she'd hoped, then I would have felt that my resignation, my dismissal, was a sacrifice worthwhile. But in the event, I was sacked, I think, on the 14th of October. And she announced her resignation on the 20th, a mere 6 days. And I've said this. I said, if you're going to throw someone under the bus, it doesn't make sense if you're going to be run over by the next bus. And I said to her at the time that you don't have to be an expert in British political history to know that a Prime Minister getting rid of their chancellor exposes them very considerably. And I said to her also at the time, forgive me, that if we got to the new year somehow, I think things would have reset. The OBR black hole was less. I think the markets might have moved on. Who knows? But as it was, I think we were in a crisis situation which was inflamed by the reaction of the Prime Minister.
You put it elegantly in a sort of historical context about chancellors falling out with prime ministers. I just want to know the emotion you felt. I mean, did you bang the table? Did you swear? Did you...
So I was pretty dry-eyed. So you've got to remember that I was in New York. I was in Washington for the IMF meeting. And I kept getting calls on the Thursday to come back a day before I was meant to. And I remember thinking, well, one of two things. Either she's going to sack me or she's going to make me reverse some more of the things in the mini budget. And I thought, in a kind of rational way, which was wrong, proved to be wrong, that if she sacked me, that would end her premiership. And so she wouldn't do that. So I kind of took that off the table mentally. So I thought she can't possibly do that because that would mean that she would be out. So she won't do that. And then when I came back, there were reports that I was going to get sacked. I've described finding out on Twitter that I was out. And it was Steve Swinford. I remember my special advisor saying,
the political editor of the Times.
That's right. And I said, well, if it's Steve Swinford, we're out, because he was the sort of go-to man at the time. And then I remember walking into the cabinet room. I was totally dry-eyed. I think she was very emotional. There were tears, I think. And she said, oh, I've got to do this, and this is necessary. And I remember thinking, this is insane. Because I know we're in a difficult position, but you doing this will accelerate the end of your premiership, not delay it. So it will have the opposite effect of what you think is going to happen. And so she was very kind enough to show me she had a press conference. I think you might even have been there. But she had a press conference immediately. I was sacked on the Friday. And I said to her, they're going to ask you, the lobby, the press hacks, if you sacked the person that you hired to do what you wanted, if he's been sacked by you, why are you still there? And of course, that's exactly what they asked. I don't think she had an answer for that. The press conference, I think, lasted 9 minutes. It was quite a short.
It was very short.
Yes. And yes.
Inadequate.
Yes. And clearly, at that point, the betting markets were against her lasting.
So you said a moment ago that it was insane what she did.
I looked at it and thought, if there's one way you're going to destroy yourself, it's by sacking me. That might have been an egotistical thing to think, but I just genuinely thought that she wasn't going to survive that.
So, since then, I sense with you, and you're sitting in this studio, and we're having hopefully an intelligent, grown-up conversation about a pretty calamitous period in British history, that she hasn't come to terms with it.
I don't know. I mean, I think that there are people who react to things, big setbacks, big crises, and it's very difficult for them to kind of try and be objective. None of us can be objective. Any student of history knows that a historian cannot be fully objective, but you can try and take a step back and look at what happened and try and look at yourself objectively, even though you can't fully do that. And I think other people will respond and say, no, I was right. I was always right. You double down. Effectively, that's the Trump method. He's never wrong. And I'm not sure what Liz is thinking right now. I think
Are
she
you in
has
touch
said-
with her?
Yeah, I mean occasionally. And
Have you seen each other socially?
Yeah, I mean I saw her in the months after we both left office, but of course now she's been travelling, she's been doing speeches and that sort of thing.
Do you think she's well?
Yeah, look, I think she's an unusual person. I think it takes
What does
a
that
great strength of character to get to the top, to get to where she did.
What does that mean, though? Come on,
I think she's unusual. I think she's someone who has got tremendous determination, tremendous drive, tremendous sense of urgency. But sometimes
a high EQ.
Well, that's the open question. I think sometimes, she doesn't.
Sounds
read
like
the
no.
room. She doesn't read the room as well as others, and she's pretty much said that. I mean, she's not a great presenter. She's got strengths and weaknesses, but I think she's got great insight and great determination. And my view on what happened to her is that at the time it seemed like a total disaster. I think as time passes, if she hadn't really said very much, I think people would be more inclined to listen to what she'd said. But how she reacted was she came straight off the bat.
There seems to be no self-reflection. I saw her briefly at the Spectator Party.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And there was...
That's one thing I'm glad to have avoided this year, not being a member of Parliament. It's always an awkward, and you've been to many of them. It's always a slightly awkward sort of
But just going
of
back,
journalists and politicians.
Sure. But just going back to her, I feel that you've kind of reflected on it, and there are stuff you still say. Broadly speaking, we got it right. I get the impression that she has gone for conspiracy theories to explain her downfall, and there were people out to get me from the very word go, even though she'd find.
Yeah, I've said publicly. I mean, my background is in academic history. I mean, I enjoy research, and so the whole conspiracy theory thing, I just turns me cold because they don't work and they don't exist.
Has she become a conspiracy theorist, or was she always one?
So I think a lot of this, being very frank, is driven by the kind of Trumpian right in the US, where essentially what he's done is always double down, and consolidate his base. And so the way you do that is by saying, I was right, these people are fake news, these people are out to get me, these people are getting me because, they want to get you. That sort of language.
I suppose what strikes me about that is that, Trump...
I think it's influencing a lot of people on the right.
But Trump has kept hold of his base.
Yeah, sure.
Liz Truss booted out of her Norfolk seat.
Yeah, that was a disaster, I think, for her, because if you're in the House of Commons, as she was, you've always got that platform, you've always got that constituency interest that you're representing. And if you're out of Parliament, like I am and like she is, you essentially become a commentator. You're not really a player on the field, as it were, whatever the metaphor you choose. And I think that makes it very difficult. And Boris is probably finding the same thing. It's very difficult to have a credible platform when you're not a representative. And I think that meant a lot to her. I think she took her constituency duties very seriously. And I think it was a great shame to her that she lost the seat.
I just wonder whether she's kind of mourning inside, or...
I think it's difficult. I mean, I stepped down. I thought I would win, and luckily my successor did win. But I stepped down because I wanted to move on. I think it's important the Conservative Party moves on. I think we need new leaders. We need new people to take the party forward. She was very much committed to staying in the Parliament. And so losing the seat the way she did must have been quite painful.
And what about Kwasi Kwarteng? If the question is asked today, what is the legacy of Kwasi Kwarteng? A-level essay. What's the final paragraph?
Well, I think a lot of people will talk about the mini budget, but there was a lot of stuff I did as energy minister. I've been talking to people about that. There are wider issues, but like I suppose the dodgy dossier in Alistair Campbell's case. There are lots of examples of politicians who were associated with
just with one thing.
Yeah, and it may well be the mini budget, but I want to move on from that. I'm 49. I like talking about it. I think it's an important and very difficult time, challenging time. But I think there's a huge possibility for the Conservatives, for the right. I think Labour have enormous challenges, which I'm not sure they're going to rise up to the occasion and solve. They're impossible challenges, many of these things. And I think there's an ongoing conversation to be had. That's why I'm here. That's why I enjoy talking about politics. And we could have talked more about the economy and how you get the economy growing. And those questions continue to fascinate me and absorb my interest.
So it doesn't sound to me like you're done with politics.
Well, I'm not an MP, and I enjoyed being an MP, but that comes with its own stresses. But I'm always fascinated, as you are, and given what you do, you must be. I'm always interested in not only British politics, but global politics, what's happening in the US, what's happening in Ukraine or Europe, what's happening in the Middle East. I don't see how one can't be interested in those things, especially if you've spent 14 years, as I have, as an MP. I was in government. And, I do a lot of broadcasting, a lot of commenting. And I can assure you, being a commentator is a lot easier than being an MP.
Okay, so an easy commentary question.
Yeah.
Trump or Harris?
Who I think will win.
No, who you'd want to win.
Difficult. I mean, I think Trump has got all sorts of problems with him, and he's got psychological issues, clearly. But Harris is a very, very far left candidate. I mean, on all the culture war issues, on all the taxation issues, she's a very left-wing candidate. And that's been obscured because there's a huge media interest in her candidature, clearly very exciting. But
if you had to choose?
I probably would vote for Trump, actually. When if you put a gun to my head and I have to choose between one or the other, not because I.
So the guy who's psychologically disturbed.
Well, no, I think you've got to look at his record. I think I liked what he did on corporation tax. I try to do the same thing, as you know. I liked low taxes. I liked the fact that he was probably the first person to call China out, which he did in 2015. I liked the fact that he was quite tough on Iran. He got people together on the Abraham Accords. So, if you ignore all the noise and the personality, the extreme elements of his personality, the record was a credible one. And I probably would, on balance, vote for that.
So you're not coming back into Parliament anytime soon?
No, I mean, look, the next parliamentary election will be, 5 years' time? And I have no plans to be a candidate. But
I have no plans.
I have no plans.
No.
I wouldn't rule it out. I don't think you should ever rule out. You can never say never in politics. You can never say never. I was fascinated. I've always wanted to be an MP. I was fascinated by being there. I wanted to leave and try something else. But who knows?
Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.